Before we begin this incredible story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss our emotional stories that touch hearts around the world. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of London as thousands of tourists gathered along the palace route. It was a typical Thursday in June, and the changing of the guard ceremony was about to begin. Among the crowd stood the Martinez family, visiting from Spain with their 8-year-old son, Lucas. The boy pressed against the metal barriers, his eyes wide with excitement as he watched the royal guards march in their distinctive red tunics and tall bearskin hats. Captain James Richardson had served in the Royal Guard for 12 years. At 34 years old, he had seen countless ceremonies and faced innumerable distractions from tourists, trying to make the stoic guards break character. But today felt different somehow. As he marched in perfect formation with his fellow guards, something in his peripheral vision kept drawing his attention to a small boy in a blue jacket. It was practically bouncing with enthusiasm. Lucas had been talking about this trip for months. His parents, Maria and Carlos, had saved for 2 years to afford this vacation. The boy had studied everything about the Royal Guards, memorizing facts about their history, their uniforms, and their unwavering discipline. He had even practiced standing still like them in front of his bedroom mirror back home in Barcelona. As the ceremony progressed, the crowd swelled. More people pushed forward, trying to get the perfect photograph. Maria held tightly to her daughter Sophia's hand, while Carlos kept one hand on Lucas's shoulder. The atmosphere was festive, filled with clicking cameras and excited chatter in dozens of languages. Then something unexpected happened. A street vendor's cart, parked on the adjacent road, suddenly broke free from its position. The vendor had forgotten to properly secure the brake, and the slight incline of the street was enough to set it in motion. At first, it rolled slowly, almost harmlessly. But as it gained momentum on the downward slope, it knocked into a delivery truck that had been idling at the corner. The truck driver had stepped out just moments before to check his delivery schedule. The impact from the cart, though seemingly minor, was enough to shift the truck out of gear. The heavy vehicle began rolling down the street, picking up speed with each passing second. Its path was aimed directly at the crowded barrier, where hundreds of tourists stood watching the ceremony. Most people didn't notice at first. The ceremony continued, drums beating in precise rhythm. But Captain Richardson saw it. Years of military training had honed his awareness of his surroundings to an almost supernatural degree. His eyes caught the movement of the truck, and in a split second, he calculated its trajectory. His blood ran cold. The truck was heading straight for the section of barrier where the young boy in the blue jacket stood. Lucas was still mesmerized by the guards, completely unaware of the danger rolling toward him at increasing speed. His parents were looking in the opposite direction, watching other guards march past. Time seemed to slow down for James. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to move, but breaking formation during a ceremony was strictly forbidden. Guards had been disciplined for far less. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for over 12 years hung in the balance. But then he looked at the boy's face. Lucas was smiling, pure joy radiating from his expression. The child was living his dream, completely innocent and unaware that in seconds his life could end. James thought of his own nephew, just about the same age. He thought about the boy's parents, who had no idea their world was about to shatter. The decision took less than a heartbeat. James broke formation. His rifle clattered to the ground as he sprinted toward the barrier. The other guards froze in confusion. The crowd gasped. Tourists lowered their cameras, unsure what was happening. Was this part of the ceremony? Had something gone wrong? James ran faster than he had ever run in his life. His heavy boots pounded against the cobblestones. The bearskin hat flew off his head. He could see the truck now bearing down, could hear the awful grinding of its wheels against the pavement. Lucas finally turned, his smile fading as he saw the massive vehicle approaching. Fear replaced joy on his small face. He was paralyzed, unable to move or scream. Maria turned and saw the truck. Her scream pierced the air, a sound of pure terror that would haunt James for years to come. Carlos reached for his son, but the crowd was too thick, the barrier in the way. They were too far. Time was running out. James reached the barrier. In one fluid motion, he vaulted over it, his arms extended. The truck was mere feet away now, its massive grille filling his vision. He could smell the diesel fuel, feel the vibration of the heavy vehicle shaking the ground. His hands found Lucas's small body. He pulled the boy backward with all his strength, twisting his own body to shield the child. The truck's bumper caught James's leg as they fell. Pain exploded through his body, but he held tight to Lucas, making sure the boy landed on top of him, protected from the impact with the ground. The truck roared past, missing them by inches, before finally crashing into a stone wall 30 feet away. The silence that followed the crash was deafening. For a moment, nobody moved. Then chaos erupted. People screamed and rushed forward. Maria and Carlos scrambled over the barrier, their hands shaking as they reached for their son. Other guards broke formation and ran to their fallen colleague. Tourists frantically dialed emergency numbers on their phones. Lucas lay on top of Captain Richardson, stunned but unharmed. The boy's eyes were wide with shock, tears streaming down his face. James kept his arms wrapped protectively around the child, even as pain radiated through his injured leg. He could feel warmth spreading across his uniform, knew he was bleeding, but none of that mattered. The boy was safe. Maria reached them first, her face pale and streaked with tears. She gently lifted Lucas from James's arms, checking her son frantically for injuries. Carlos knelt beside them, his hands hovering over his son, afraid to touch him, afraid he might discover something broken. But Lucas was fine. Not a scratch on him. The only damage was the fear in his eyes. Other guards helped James sit up carefully. His left leg was twisted at an odd angle, and blood soaked through his trouser leg. The truck's bumper had struck him with tremendous force, and from the way pain shot through him with every tiny movement, he suspected multiple fractures. But he smiled anyway, relief flooding through him as he watched the Martinez family embrace. Within minutes, ambulances arrived, their sirens cutting through the morning air. Paramedics rushed to James's side, carefully examining his injuries while preparing him for transport. The ceremony had been completely abandoned now. Guards stood in clusters discussing what they had witnessed. Commanding officers spoke urgently into radios, trying to manage the situation. A senior officer, Colonel Peterson, approached James as the paramedics worked on securing his leg. The colonel's face was stern, unreadable. James knew what was coming. He had broken protocol, abandoned his post during an official ceremony. There would be consequences, possibly severe ones. His career might be over, but before the colonel could speak, Maria Martinez rushed over. She dropped to her knees beside the stretcher, taking James's hand in both of hers. Her English was broken, heavily accented, but her emotion was universal. She thanked him over and over, her voice choked with tears. Carlos stood behind her, one hand on his wife's shoulder, the other holding Lucas. The boy stared at James with a mixture of awe and gratitude that made the captain's throat tight. Lucas stepped forward, slipping from his father's grasp. He approached the stretcher hesitantly, then suddenly leaned forward and hugged James as tightly as his small arms could manage. The boy whispered something in Spanish that James didn't understand, but the sentiment was clear. The crowd, which had been watching in stunned silence, suddenly erupted in applause. The clapping started with one person, then spread like wildfire through the gathered tourists. Hundreds of people applauded, some with tears in their eyes, all of them having witnessed something extraordinary. The ceremony they had come to see had been forgotten, replaced by something far more meaningful. They had watched a man sacrifice his own safety without hesitation to save a child's life. Colonel Peterson's stern expression cracked. The older man cleared his throat, blinking rapidly. He placed a hand on James's shoulder and squeezed gently. Whatever reprimand he had been preparing died on his lips. Instead, he simply nodded, a gesture of profound respect passing between the two soldiers as the paramedics loaded James into the ambulance. The Martinez family insisted on accompanying him. Maria still clutched his hand, unwilling to let go of the man who had saved her son. Carlos spoke rapidly to one of the paramedics, explaining in broken English that they needed to stay with the guard, that they owed him everything. The hospital was a blur of activity. Doctors examined James's leg, taking x-rays and conferring in low voices. The diagnosis was serious but not catastrophic. His leg was broken in 2 places, and he had torn several ligaments. He would need surgery immediately, followed by months of physical therapy. His days as a royal guard were likely over, at least in active duty capacity. But as James lay in the hospital bed waiting for surgery, he felt no regret. Maria and Carlos had been allowed to stay nearby and through the doorway. He could see Lucas sitting in the waiting room, coloring in a book his parents had bought from the hospital gift shop. The boy was safe, alive, probably would grow up to have children of his own someday. That was worth any price. News of the incident spread quickly. Within hours, video footage from dozens of tourist phones had been uploaded to social media. The clips showed James's sprint toward the barrier, his desperate leap to save Lucas, the truck missing them by mere inches. The videos went viral, shared millions of times across platforms around the world. Major news networks picked up the story. Headlines proclaimed him a hero. The palace issued a statement praising his quick thinking and selfless bravery. Messages of support flooded in from around the globe, from ordinary citizens and dignitaries alike. But James, sedated and preparing for surgery, was unaware of any of it. In the recovery room after surgery, James woke to find his hospital room filled with flowers. Cards and letters covered every available surface. A palace representative sat quietly in the corner, waiting to speak with him. But more importantly, the Martinez family was still there. Maria had refused to leave, camping out in the waiting room for the entire 6-hour surgery. When James's eyes fluttered open, first thing he saw was a drawing taped to the wall beside his bed. It showed a stick figure in a red uniform and tall black hat, holding hands with a smaller stick figure in blue. Above it, in careful, childish letters, Lucas had written "My hero" in both English and Spanish. The days following the accident transformed James's life in ways he never could have imagined. His small hospital room became a gathering place for well-wishers. Though the staff had to limit visitors to prevent overwhelming their patient, the Martinez family visited every single day, bringing fresh fruit, flowers, and most importantly, their smiles. Lucas had overcome his initial shock and now chattered excitedly during each visit, telling James about all the other sights they were seeing in London. The boy had become something of a celebrity himself, with tourists recognizing him from the viral videos and asking for photos. But Lucas always made sure to tell everyone about the brave guard who had saved his life. Maria had extended their vacation, unable to leave until she knew James was truly recovering. She brought him homemade Spanish dishes, smuggling them past the nurses who pretended not to notice. Carlos, a carpenter by trade, promised to build James anything he wanted once he recovered. An offer made with such earnest gratitude that James found himself deeply moved. The palace representative who had waited in his room that first day returned several times. Her name was Elizabeth Thornton, and she worked in the Royal Communications Office. She brought news that the Queen herself had been informed of his actions and wished to honor him once he recovered. She also brought more complicated news about his future with the Guard. As James had suspected, his active duty days were over. The injuries to his leg were too severe for him to maintain the physical standards required for ceremonial duties. At 34, his career as a guard had come to an abrupt end. Elizabeth spoke gently as she explained this, clearly uncomfortable delivering news that might devastate him. But James surprised her by accepting it calmly. He had made his choice in that split second, and he would make the same choice again without hesitation. Some things mattered more than careers or protocols. Elizabeth seemed relieved by his attitude. And then she shared something that made him sit up straighter, despite the pain in his leg. The palace wanted to offer him a position as an instructor at the Guard. Training facility, his years of experience, combined with his demonstrated judgment under pressure, made him ideal for teaching the next generation of guards. The role would allow him to continue serving, to share his knowledge, to shape young soldiers into the kind of men who understood that rules existed to serve people, not the other way around. James accepted immediately. The relief on Elizabeth's face told him she had been worried he might refuse, might feel the offer was a consolation prize. But to James, it felt like a new beginning, a chance to make a difference in a different way. Social media continued to explode with the story. Professional news crews camped outside the hospital, hoping for an interview. The hashtag #SaveByAGuard trended worldwide for 3 days. People shared their own stories of selfless acts, inspired by James's example. Artists created illustrations of the rescue. Musicians wrote songs. The incident had touched something deep in people, reminding them that genuine heroism still existed in the world. A particular video angle, captured by a tourist from Germany, showed the moment of decision on James's face with remarkable clarity. You could see him notice the truck, see him calculate the danger, see the instant when duty warred with humanity. And then you could watch as humanity won. That video alone was viewed over 50 million times, with people from every continent commenting on the raw emotion visible in that split. Second choice, but not all the attention was positive. Some criticized James for breaking formation, arguing that soldiers must follow orders regardless of circumstances. Military discipline bloggers debated whether he had set a dangerous precedent. A few commentators suggested he should have alerted other guards instead of acting alone. Though anyone who watched the videos could see, there had been no time for that. James tried to ignore the criticism, focusing instead on his recovery. The surgery had been successful, but the rehabilitation was grueling. Physical therapists visited daily, putting him through exercises that left him sweating and gritting his teeth against the pain. The doctors warned him he would likely walk with a slight limp for the rest of his life. His fellow guards visited when their duties allowed. They brought news from the palace, gossip about officers, updates on the investigation into how the truck had rolled free. The vendor whose cart had started the chain of events had been devastated, visiting the hospital twice to apologize tearfully. James had assured him it was an accident, that no one blamed him. But the man carried his guilt visibly. The truck driver had also visited, a middle-aged man named Robert who could barely speak through his tears. He explained that he had only stepped away for a moment, that his emergency brake had been faulty, that he would never forgive himself for what almost happened. James spent an hour talking with him, finally convincing Robert that he too was not at fault, that sometimes terrible things almost happen despite everyone's best intentions. On his 5th day in the hospital, James received an unexpected visitor. His ex-wife, Jennifer, appeared in his doorway looking uncertain and nervous. They had divorced 3 years earlier, the marriage a casualty of his long hours and frequent absences. She had remarried and moved to Scotland. James hadn't seen her since signing the final papers. Jennifer sat beside his bed, twisting her hands in her lap. She had seen the videos, she explained. She had watched him risk everything for a child he didn't know, and it had made her cry. She apologized for the bitter things she had said during their divorce, for accusing him of being cold and emotionless, obsessed with duty above all else. The videos had shown her the truth about who he really was. They talked for hours, not about rekindling their relationship, but about finding peace with their past. Jennifer confessed that she was happy now, that her new husband was good to her, but that she had always carried guilt about the things she had said in anger. Watching James save Lucas had reminded her of all the good in him that she had forgotten. When she left, they hugged carefully, mindful of his injuries. It felt like closing a chapter that had been left painfully open. James felt lighter somehow, as if her visit had released something he hadn't known he was carrying. 2 weeks after the accident, James was finally released from the hospital. He left in a wheelchair, his legs still in a heavy cast, but he was grateful to be mobile again. The Martinez family had reluctantly returned to Spain the day before, their extended vacation finally at an end. The goodbye with Lucas had been emotional, the boy crying and hugging James for a long time before his parents gently pulled him away. Maria had pressed a package into James's hands before leaving, making him promise not to open it until he got home. Carlos had gripped his shoulder, then pulled him into a careful hug, whispering in Spanish what James understood to be a blessing. They promised to stay in touch, to visit again, to never forget what he had done for them. James's sister, Rebecca, drove him to his flat in South London. She had been visiting daily at the hospital, bringing fresh clothes and handling his mail. Now she fussed over him like a mother hen, insisting on staying for a few days to help him adjust to being home. James protested that he could manage, but secretly he was grateful for her presence that evening. After Rebecca had prepared dinner and bullied him into eating more than he wanted, James finally opened Maria's package. Inside was a hand-knitted scarf in the colors of the British flag, clearly made with great care. Wrapped within it was a photo album containing pictures of Lucas from birth through his 8th birthday. Along with photos from their London trip taken before the accident, the final page of the album made James's eyes burn with tears. It was a photo taken in the hospital, Lucas sitting on the edge of James's bed, both of them smiling at the camera. Maria had written in careful English beneath it, "The day our son got a second chance at life. It, and a guardian angel in a red coat. We will never forget. With eternal gratitude and love, the Martinez family." The following weeks settled into a routine of physical therapy, medication schedules, and learning to navigate his flat with crutches. James discovered muscles he didn't know existed, all of them protesting the new demands of moving with a broken leg. His physical therapist, a stern woman named Patricia, pushed him relentlessly while somehow making him laugh through the pain. Letters and packages continued to arrive daily. A school in Manchester had organized a card-making project, sending hundreds of colorful drawings and notes from children thanking him for being a hero. An elderly woman in Cornwall sent him her late husband's military medals, saying he deserved them more. A teenage girl wrote about how watching his video had inspired her to pursue a career in emergency services. The most touching letter came from a man in Australia, who explained that 30 years earlier, a stranger had pulled him from a burning car at great personal risk. That stranger had died from his injuries a week later. The man had spent his life wondering if he was worthy of the sacrifice. Watching James's video had finally given him peace, he wrote, because it showed him that heroes didn't calculate worth. They simply acted because it was right. James tried to respond to as many letters as possible, though the volume was overwhelming. Rebecca helped when she could, and eventually some of his fellow guards volunteered to assist. They would gather at his flat in the evenings, reading letters aloud and helping craft responses. It became a bonding experience. These hardened soldiers moved to tears by the heartfelt messages from strangers. 6 weeks after the accident, James received an official invitation to Buckingham Palace. The Queen wished to meet him personally and present him with a medal for his bravery. The ceremony was scheduled for 3 months away, giving his leg time to heal enough that he could stand, hopefully without crutches. For the formal presentation, the news reignited media interest. Journalists requested interviews, morning shows invited him to appear, documentary producers pitched ideas. James declined most of them, uncomfortable with the attention. He had simply done what any decent person would do, he insisted. Though everyone around him disagreed, eventually he agreed to one interview with the BBC, hoping it might satisfy the public's curiosity and allow him to return to some semblance of privacy. The interviewer, a kind man named David, conducted the session in James's flat, keeping it conversational rather than sensational. When David asked why he had broken formation, James paused for a long moment. He thought about all the complex answers he could give about duty and morality and split-second decisions. But in the end, he said simply that he had seen a child in danger and nothing else mattered. Rules existed to protect people, he explained. And following a rule that resulted in a child's death would have been the real violation of duty. The interview aired during prime time and was viewed by millions. James's simple, honest explanation resonated with people far beyond what any elaborate justification could have achieved. He received messages from other soldiers, police officers, firefighters, and emergency workers, thanking him for articulating something they all felt but struggled to express. Meanwhile, James began preparing for his new role as an instructor. He studied teaching methodologies, reviewed training curricula, and met with current instructors to understand the role better. Colonel Peterson, who had been appointed as his mentor during the transition, shared that they wanted James to develop a new unit focused on ethical decision-making under pressure. The idea excited James more than he had expected. He could help shape not just technically proficient guards, but thinking, feeling human beings who understood that the uniform served a higher purpose. He spent hours drafting lesson plans, creating scenarios, imagining how to teach what he had learned through 12 years of service in one moment of crisis. Lucas called every Sunday using video chat. The boy had returned to his normal life in Barcelona, but remained fascinated by the guards and by James personally. He had started learning English more seriously, determined to communicate better with his hero. During their calls, Lucas would practice his new vocabulary, and James would patiently correct his pronunciation. Delighted by the boy's enthusiasm, Maria and Carlos remained in constant contact as well. They shared photos of Lucas's return to school, where he had become quite popular, telling the story of his adventure in London. They sent updates on their own lives, treating James like extended family. Carlos had indeed built something for him, a beautiful wooden box with intricate carvings depicting the palace and guards, which arrived carefully packaged with a note saying it was for keeping precious things. 3 months after the accident, James stood in his dress uniform in front of the mirror, adjusting his medals one final time. Today was the palace ceremony. His leg had healed well enough that he could walk without crutches, though Patricia had insisted he use a cane for longer distances. The slight limp the doctors had predicted was there, but barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. Rebecca fussed with his collar, tears already threatening her mascara. She had been emotional all morning, alternating between pride and anxiety. Their parents were flying in from Edinburgh, having insisted they wouldn't miss this moment for anything. Even his nephew, Rebecca's 10-year-old son Tommy, was dressed in his finest clothes, practically vibrating with excitement about visiting the palace. The ceremony was private, not the large public affair that often accompanied royal honors. James preferred it that way. The guest list was small: his immediate family, a handful of fellow guards, Colonel Peterson, and special permission had been granted for the Martinez family to attend. They had flown in 2 days earlier, staying with James in his now very cramped flat, filling it with laughter and Spanish chatter as the car drove through the palace gates. James felt butterflies in his stomach for the first time since his military training. He had been here countless times as a guard, had stood watch in these very halls. But entering as a guest, as someone being honored, felt surreal. Lucas pressed his face against the car window, pointing out everything with breathless excitement. Inside, palace staff guided them through corridors James knew by heart, but which took on new meaning without his uniform separating him from them. Gold-framed paintings watched their procession, centuries of history bearing witness to this moment. They were shown to a small but elegant room where refreshments had been laid out. Other recipients of honors mingled nervously, each with their own story of service or bravery. An equerry appeared, impeccably dressed, and began organizing people for the ceremony. James's family would watch from a designated area. He would enter with the other recipients, and each would be called forward individually. The equerry explained the protocol. Walk forward when called. Stop at the marker, slight bow. Accept the medal, step back, bow again. Exit to the side. James had performed more complex drill movements 1,000 times, but his hands trembled slightly as they lined up. A woman beside him, being honored for her charity work with homeless youth, noticed his nervousness and smiled kindly. She whispered that she felt like she might faint. They shared a moment of solidarity to ordinary people about to experience something extraordinary. The ceremony room was smaller than James had imagined, more intimate. His family sat in the front row, Rebecca already dabbing at her eyes. Lucas sat between his parents, his small hand gripping his mother's tightly. The boy's eyes were huge, taking in every detail of the room. The guards standing at attention, the elaborate decorations. The Queen entered, and everyone stood. James had seen her from a distance many times during his service, but never this close. She moved with a grace that belied her years, her expression kind but dignified. She took her position, and the ceremony began. One by one, recipients were called forward. A nurse who had saved multiple lives during a hospital fire, a teacher who had tackled an armed intruder at her school, a teenager who had rescued his entire family from a flood. Each had their moment, their story briefly told, their courage recognized. Then James heard his name. Captain James Richardson, for exceptional bravery and selfless action in saving the life of a child. His leg threatened to buckle as he took his first step, but training took over. His back straightened, his shoulders squared, and he walked forward with as much dignity as he could muster. He stopped at the marker, bowed, and looked up to meet the Queen's eyes. She studied him for a moment, and he saw something in her gaze that surprised him. Not just formal approval, but genuine warmth, perhaps even gratitude. She spoke quietly, words meant just for him, thanking him for his years of service and for upholding the highest traditions of duty and compassion. As she pinned the medal to his uniform, James felt the weight of it, both physical and symbolic. This small piece of metal represented not just his own action, but every person who had ever chosen kindness over convenience, who had risked themselves for others, who had remembered that being human meant caring for one another. He stepped back, bowed again, and turned to leave. As he did, he caught Lucas's eye. The boy was crying silently, tears streaming down his face, but he was smiling the biggest smile James had ever seen. Carlos had his arm around his son, and Maria had her hand over her heart. That moment, seeing the family alive and together and happy, meant more to James than any medal ever could. After the ceremony, there was a reception. The Queen moved through the room, speaking briefly with each recipient. When she reached James, Lucas approached hesitantly, encouraged by his parents. The Queen, to everyone's surprise, knelt down to the boy's level and spoke with him gently. Lucas, in his careful English, thanked her for honoring the man who saved his life. The Queen smiled and told Lucas that brave people inspired others to be brave too. She said that James had reminded everyone that true nobility came not from titles or positions, but from actions and choices. She hoped Lucas would remember this day and let it guide him to do good things in his own life. Later, at a dinner organized by his fellow guards, James sat surrounded by the people who mattered most. His parents beamed with pride. Rebecca made everyone laugh with embarrassing childhood stories. Tommy pestered him with questions about military life. The Martinez family shared Spanish wine and taught everyone a traditional toast. Colonel Peterson stood to make a speech, but emotion overwhelmed him partway through. He had to pause, clear his throat, and start again. He spoke about what it meant to serve, about the burden of the uniform, and about how James had reminded them all why they had chosen this path. He raised his glass to honor not just a soldier, but a man who understood that the greatest duty was to our shared humanity. 6 months had passed since the accident, and James stood in front of his first class of guard trainees. 20 young faces stared back at him, a mixture of curiosity and nervousness evident in their expressions. They were fresh recruits still, rough around the edges, full of idealism and uncertainty about what lay ahead. James had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but he had decided to begin not with drill movements or protocol, but with a question. He asked them why they had joined the Guard. The answers varied. Some spoke of family tradition. Others mentioned the honor of serving the crown. A few admitted they were drawn to the pageantry and history. He listened to each response carefully, nodding thoughtfully. Then he told them about a Thursday morning in June, about a ceremony that seemed routine, about a split second that changed everything. He didn't glorify what he had done or make himself out to be exceptional. Instead, he talked about the weight of the decision, the consequences he had faced, and the lesson he had learned. The lesson was this: the uniform gave them authority. Tradition gave them purpose, but humanity gave them meaning. Rules and protocols existed for good reasons, he explained, and should be followed faithfully. But when the moment came that following a rule would violate something more fundamental, they had to be ready to make the harder choice. One recruit, barely 18 years old, raised his hand tentatively. He asked what James would tell someone who was afraid they might not be brave enough when tested. James smiled at the honest question. He confessed that he had been terrified, that his hands had shaken afterwards, that he still sometimes woke up from nightmares where he'd been too slow. Bravery, he told them, was not the absence of fear. It was acting despite fear, because something mattered more than your own comfort or safety. Every person in this room was capable of it, he assured them, because every person had things they cared about more than themselves. The training program James developed became known for its unusual approach. Yes, his recruits learned perfect marching, flawless weapon handling, and impeccable uniform standards. But they also studied ethics, discussed moral dilemmas, and practiced situational awareness that went beyond military applications. They learned to see the people around them not as potential security threats or distractions, but as human beings they were sworn to protect. Word of his teaching methods spread. Other military training facilities requested his curriculum. He was invited to speak at conferences about leadership and decision-making. Attention made him uncomfortable, but he recognized it as an opportunity to spread ideas he believed in deeply. Lucas continued to grow. Their Sunday calls became a cherished ritual for both of them. The boy excelled in school, particularly in languages and history. He had developed a fascination with different cultures and spoke often about wanting to travel and meet people from around the world. James encouraged this, seeing in the child a kindness and openness that the world desperately needed. The Martinez family visited London every year, timing their trips to coincide with the changing of the guard ceremony. They would stand in the crowd and watch. Lucas now understanding the precision and discipline involved in ways he hadn't before. Afterward, they would have dinner with James, sharing stories and laughter, maintaining a connection that went far deeper than the incident that had brought them together. James's personal life evolved too. He started dating Sarah, a physical therapist he had met during his rehabilitation. She understood his dedication to his work and the occasional darkness that crept in when he thought too hard about what might have been. She had her own story of loss and resilience, having lost her father in a military operation overseas. They found comfort in each other's company, building something genuine and patient. On the first anniversary of the accident, James returned to the spot where it had happened. Someone had placed flowers there, though he didn't know who. He stood for a long time, remembering the rush of fear, the desperate sprint, the impact, but mostly he thought about Lucas's smile, about a life that had continued, about all the moments that child would experience because of a single decision. A tourist approached him, recognizing him from the videos that still circulated occasionally online. She asked if she could shake his hand, and when he agreed, she told him about her own son, who was Lucas's age. She said she thought about James every time her boy did something reckless. Every time he ran into the street or climbed too high, she thanked him for reminding her how precious and fragile life was. James walked back to the training facility, where his next class awaited. He had come to understand that his real impact wasn't the single rescue, as important as that had been. It was what came after. It was the recruits he trained who went out into the world carrying his lessons. It was the people who watched the video and thought differently about kindness and courage. It was the ripple effect of one good choice. In his office, he kept Lucas's drawing in a frame on his desk. My hero in those childish letters reminded him daily why any of this mattered. Next to it sat Carlos's wooden box, which he used to store letters from people his story had touched. There were hundreds now, each representing someone who had been moved to think, feel, or act differently. His students began to file in for afternoon training. James stood, automatically checking his uniform, despite the fact that it no longer bore the ceremonial red tunic, just the standard instructor's attire. But the pride he felt in wearing it was unchanged. He was still serving, still part of something larger than himself. As the class settled, he noticed a new recruit in the back row with a photo pinned inside his locker. It showed a young girl, probably the recruit's sister or daughter. The young man caught James looking and gave a small nod, as if to say he understood what they were really training for. Not the ceremonies or the traditions, important as those were, but the moments that would test what kind of men they truly were. James began the lesson, his voice steady and clear.
Outside.
London continued its endless rhythm, millions of lives intersecting in countless ways. Somewhere in Barcelona, a 9-year-old boy was finishing his homework, perhaps glancing at the photo on his wall of himself with a royal guard who had taught him that heroes were real. The story that had begun with a split-second decision continued to unfold in ways large and small. James Richardson had saved one life in a moment of crisis, but in doing so, he had touched thousands of others. He had reminded the world that, In our darkest moments of decision, when rules clash with conscience, the most human choice is often the most heroic one. And that lesson passed from teacher to student, from parent to child, from stranger to stranger, was perhaps the greatest legacy of all. Not the medal in his drawer or the viral videos or the ceremony with the queen, but the simple understanding that we are all capable of extraordinary courage when we choose to put others before ourselves. James smiled at his students and began to teach.